periods about this particular book. We're trying to do our best to simplify as much as we can simplify and try to make sure that we gain the core meanings and the core message of the book and get lost in all the symbolic nature of it. These things were signified. We talked last Wednesday about how Homer Haley, I think, uses the word signified. There's signs and symbols that are used to describe the message that we're dealing with here in Revelation. And certainly we're going to have to try to dissect some of those in order to gain some understanding of the book. But we'll also try to keep things as simple as we can in terms of understanding the core message of what the Revelator's trying to do. And he's trying to encourage them. They're persecuted, they're challenged, they're hurting. And he's trying to write to them a message that will both encourage them to give them boldness to continue in their faith and their relationship with Jesus. And the message has really been kind of focused on that even so far that we have studied. In verse 8, Jesus says of himself, I am what? I am Alpha and Omega, which means beginning and the end. Why does Alpha and Omega mean beginning and the end? All right, the first and last letter from the Greek alphabet, right? And so that's why that imagery, that's one of the simplest ones we have to kind of understand and figure out. I am the beginning. What's he mean by that? Okay, I'm eternal. Okay, I'm eternal. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, saith the Lord, which is and which was and which is to come, the Almighty. There are some difficulties, maybe in some senses, of trying to figure out which reference there is or who is the Lord in this moment. But I do believe we're probably dealing with a direct relationship to Jesus that we're seeing here in this picture. But there's something we need to understand in relationship to why would he refer to himself as this beginning and end. And it's referenced back one verse to the fact that he said, I'm coming in the what? I'm coming with clouds, and every eye shall see, and they also which pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him, even so all men. And so when he says, I'm coming in the clouds, what's he referring to? Okay, I'm hearing 5 things, so I'm trying to make sure I get them all. Go ahead, Bob. Okay, you think he's talking about this? Okay, the second, but you're talking specifically to his return. Okay, I'm just trying to make sure I understand what everybody's saying. So I've heard that. I think three different ones say. Okay. Any other thoughts? Don't be afraid. Yeah. And we may, Bob, and again, like I said, we're going to get into this study at times, and we're not always going to match up in terms of what we're seeing here. I don't necessarily see this phrase, I am Alpha and Omega, as a time issue, as him trying to refer to himself as I was there at the beginning, and I'll be there at the end. I saw that more as just who he is. I'm eternal. Why should and let's not lose the scope of the book here. And here's one of those challenges that we have. Sometimes we start running in a direction that doesn't necessarily fit what the message is about. He's trying to encourage them. If I'm being persecuted by somebody and they're getting away with it, what do I want? Well, and not even necessarily retribution, but relief, and I want judgment. Okay, I want justice. Behold, he cometh with clouds. I want you to run into, let me make sure I've got my references right, and maybe won't take time to look at all of them, but you can look at Isaiah 19 and verse 1. Isaiah 19 and verse 1. The burden of Egypt. Behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. You can look at Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 13. And behold, he shall come up as clouds, and his chariots shall be as a whirlwind. His horses are swifter than eagles. Woe unto us, for we are spoiled. Here's my thought. The reference to clouds in Revelation 1, verse 7 is patterned after an image that has already been illustrated in the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah. What's going on in Isaiah? What's he talking about when the clouds? He's talking about a judgment of Jehovah that is coming. What's he talking about here in Jeremiah 4, verse 13? He's talking about the judgment that God is sending forth. This imagery of judgment coming in the clouds is not something new, in other words. When it's said there in Revelation 1 and verse 7, it's something that has already been used to illustrate the idea of the judgment of God. I can be wrong, and I'm going to say that a billion times probably before we get done with this study of the book of Revelation. I saw more, and I can be wrong. I see more of the idea that there's judgment coming against this persecution in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 7. Not so much the idea of a specific end-time judgment that is to come. And here's why I believe that, or here's why I've concluded that. I don't know how much encouragement it brings to the listener of that day to say to them, way out here somewhere is a judgment coming. And so it will be, and I don't know, if God's actually going to deal with the persecution and the challenges long before Jesus ever returns. There will be relief from those persecutions and burdens. And so, again, that's just where I'm at in my understanding of the text. I don't know that he's pointing to the second coming of Jesus there in Revelation chapter 1 and in verse 7. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And all the work necessary for him to fulfill in that. And I can see that in the imagery as well. I guess the biggest thing I wanted us to make sure we saw was the fact that anytime there's a reference to some kind of judgment, it doesn't always point to final judgment. It can point to any kind of judgment that God would bring against any circumstance, as we saw in Isaiah, as we see in Jeremiah, and potentially, as I see here in verse 7. I don't know that there's an overwhelming need in some senses. I don't know that it changes if you've concluded that he's dealing with the second coming. That's just not what I happen to see here. Yeah, and I get, especially when you add that phrase, "and every eye shall see him." I can see how that could help, might lead somebody, because that's imagery we do see about the second coming of Jesus. So I'm not saying there's no language here that might point you in that direction. It just, in this stage, it just isn't where I felt I was being pointed to. And yeah, right. I don't recall actually. I'd have to go back and look to see whether it was singular or plural in terms of cloud. I don't. Again, I'm not sure. But yeah, how even with that there could why somebody might point to the because the cloud is used in both settings. Go ahead, man.
In Matthew chapter 24, starting in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. And you shall see the Son of Man coming in clouds of heaven with power and great glory.
Yeah. And and Matthew 24 might introduce a whole other discussion. Yeah, and because there's even schools of thought in relationship to Matthew 24. Is it dealing with is it all end times? Is it all destruction of Jerusalem, or is there a break in the narrative at some point? But you're right, there is, and so I'm willing to accept the fact that there is imagery of this coming in the clouds and this reference of clouds and judgment. I agree that there are references that match up to the second coming of Jesus. And so I'm not going to argue against anybody who's drawn that conclusion. It just wasn't the conclusion that I came to looking at the whole of the narrative of the book.
Based on what Brian just said, I think we need to keep that in remembrance. And he mentioned verses 29 and 30 of Matthew 24. Let's keep in mind that was spoken in Jesus' teaching there before verse 34 of Matthew 24, which says that those things that he already said would not come to pass until they would come to pass in
that generation.
So that up to that point was definitely dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah, and that again is the challenge of that particular text, trying to see where the breaks are in the discussion. We'll have our hands tied in some ways here with where we're at as well. But be that as it may, I'm here's a perfect example. Here we are, 7 verses in, and it illustrates what we're going to run into throughout the book. It's going to be hard sometimes to try to pinpoint. But here's the thought, though. Let me get back to core. Judgment is coming. There is answer to your problems, as he writes this letter to these 7 churches in Asia. There's answer coming. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am eternal. The beginning and the end, saith the Lord, which is and which was and which is to come, the Almighty. Have we seen that language before already? This idea of which is, which was, which is to... Yes, we've already seen it more specifically in relationship to whom? God the Father. And now most likely what we have seen is a reference in the same fashion towards God the Son. We've also seen references to God the Spirit. Let me give you for thought. Verse 4 establishes the power of God the Father and God the Spirit. The question they have isn't, do I still believe in God? The question they might have in their minds under this persecution is, do I still trust whom? Jesus. Do I still trust Jesus? Because He's the reason I'm having all these problems. I'm having my persecution and difficulty because I'm a believer in Jesus the Christ. Should I continue in that integrity of relationship with Jesus? Because it seems to be the source of my trouble. Can I in some ways disconnect from Jesus and still stay connected to God the Father and God the Spirit? And so Jesus comes in this revelation through John, and he reminds him of the basic core understanding of the Godhead. That what God the Father is, God the Son is, and what God the Spirit is, that they work in unison together. And the answer is yes. Continue to trust in Jesus. I know you're challenged. I know you're being persecuted. But just like God the Father is, was, and is to come, I, the Lord, Jesus the Christ, am also Alpha and Omega. I also am, was, and will be. And I'm reliable in that relationship. And that's the simplistic thought that I saw in relationship to that conversation through verse 8. Look at question 7, or question F then. If you're following in your worksheets, we're bouncing and answering the questions as we go. And it's a simple answer to that question when he said, I am the what? I am the Alpha and the Omega. Out of verse 8. All right, any other thoughts about that? You'll have to excuse my voice today. I'm fighting a chest cold or something that started yesterday. Verse 9. So I, John, who also am your brother and companion in tribulation and in the kingdom and patience of Jesus Christ, was in the isle that is called Patmos for the word of God and for the testimony of Jesus Christ. Why was John in trouble? Because of his preaching, basically. Because of the word of God. Because of the testimony of Jesus Christ. I'm on the isle that is called Patmos. Which was what, by the way? It's basically a prison sentence, okay? It's a prison camp. And in not the most hospitable of locations. If I understand it, it's a big old rocky island. And so there's this relationship that John is trying to share with them to appreciate. I'm in this with you. I send this letter to you. And I'm not someone sending a letter to you who doesn't understand what you're going through. I'm being persecuted and challenged just like you. I'm a prisoner because of my convictions and my preaching of Jesus Christ. And I'm just as challenged as you are in this tribulation. I'm a companion in it with you. Sometimes we're willing to embrace the things that people share with us and teach us and encourage us in just because we see the value in the encouragement. Sometimes there is a greater appreciation for what's being shared with me because I know the person who's telling me is experiencing the same challenge. To me, in some ways, it's more receptive for me to hear what John's trying to tell me and to embrace the encouragement. Don't leave Jesus. He's still trustworthy. You need to stay the course. That whole message that's coming from John, I can understand how they might be reluctant if John is sitting in a posh hotel somewhere, as comfortable as he can be, while he's writing this letter to them. You stay the course, right? No, John says, I'm writing from an inhospitable location, and I'm here and being challenged because of my preaching of the word of Jesus. I'm in this. I'm a companion with tribulation. I see that as his moment to kind of help them appreciate that their need to be receptive to his message. So he says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day and heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet. And so John begins this process of trying to describe then what he sees while he was in the Spirit. By the way, we've already answered question G, which is John was on the Isle of Patmos. And so I was in the Spirit. Is very specific to John. And what I want us to simply appreciate about that is that we should be very careful to try to imply that what John experienced here that I could experience. Now, this is a very specific moment. There's something very particular that's happening in relationship to John for the benefit of others. Same kinds of thing that you see with Ezekiel. Very specific nature to what's happening to John here in this. And John was receiving specific vision and knowledge from the Spirit. Very, very direct. Other men were inspired. Other men had received the Comforter. Other men had received the knowledge that had been shared with them through inspiration. When we have the Scriptures, we have that message that was God-breathed. It is the message that came from God. John received something very peculiar here in relationship to the manner in which the Spirit delivers this knowledge and information to him. Something very different than what others might have experienced in terms of receiving knowledge that could be shared with others. He says this happened when? On the Lord's Day. As far as I can tell, that probably just refers to what it sounds like. This happened on the Lord's Day, which is a phrase that kind of becomes more notable in New Testament times. And under the Old Testament system, they had the what? They had the Sabbath. In New Testament times, that changes. The emphasis of the day of worship became on the Lord's Day, the first day of the week. And I think that's probably as simple as it can be in terms of what John's referring to here. What I find fascinating about that is, if, without being overly speculative, most likely what's John doing on this day? He's trying to find some way to worship. I would assume that, knowing the character of John, that it is the first day of the week, if it is the Lord's Day, if it's that day that had been established for believers in Jesus to worship the Creator, I would have to conclude that most likely at some point in this day, John was involved in that very aspect of his relationship. And so it's fitting that on this particular day, this Lord's Day, that John receives this moment where he sees this vision. And just quickly recognize there are two phrases in Scripture, and they're not identical. There are times where you see the phrase the Lord's Day. There are times where you see the phrase Day of the Lord. Those are two different things. Day of the Lord generally refers to any kind of judgment that might have come. Lord's Day generally refers to a moment in time, the first day of the week. I don't know that that's all that significant here. I just find it kind of interesting, at least, that most likely what John would be doing on that day seems fitting to what's about to happen to him in relationship to receiving this vision from the Spirit. Well, it's definitely different than just receiving knowledge. He's going to see things. He's in some senses, he's going to be almost present in some other realm, if you will, for lack of a better description. It's much bigger than just getting some knowledge, because he's going to have to write down the things he hears, the things he sees, and so this is. I mean, you might call it a dreamlike state, but I don't know how to define it really. But it's different than just being inspired to write something. Much bigger than that. Yeah. So and he's going to be that way throughout this revelation. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to look. Yeah. So he says in verse 11, I am Alpha and Omega. There's that phrase again. The first and the last. And what thou seest, write in a book. I'm not trying to make too much of this, but I found it interesting in my own personal study. He said, what thou seest, write in a what? Singular or plural? Singular. Book. And send, King James adds this, but send it unto the 7 churches which are in Asia. Here's all I'm thinking. My whole thought process forever has always been that there'd be what? Here's one for you, 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 till you get to 7, right? I don't know. There's potential here that you're not dealing with 7 copies. You're dealing with a book that then is shared with all 7 places, which helps us understand the earlier blessing that was in chapter 1, when in verse 3, when he said, blessed be the reader, because you're going to have probably a single person in every place who's going to stand before that congregation and read this book to the people. I can't prove it because I wasn't there. But I know he says book singular, and he says send it singular. And my conclusion has been maybe that's more likely of how this happens. If somebody comes and carries this book and they get to the church at Pergamos, and then they take that book and it goes to Smyrna, and they take that book and it goes to Ephesus. And that's how this message was presented to these 7 churches. He says, send it to the 7 churches which are in Asia. And some say, well, that wasn't all of the churches in Asia. That's true. We pointed that out. Troas, I believe, would be in that part of the region as well. But I don't have an issue with that because he said, send it unto the 7 churches which are in Asia unto. In other words, generic form, 7 churches in Asia. Specific form, here's the exact 7 I'm talking about. Send to Ephesus, unto Smyrna, unto Pergamos, unto Thyatira, unto Sardis, unto Philadelphia, and unto Laodicea. Send it to those 7. Make sure those 7 places see this message that you're going to write down in a book. Why not the other churches in Asia? Your answer is as good as mine, and neither one of them may necessarily be right. I don't know. Why not the others? But why does the church at Ephesus get a letter from Paul, but another church doesn't? Why does Corinthians get blessed with 2 letters, and other places apparently didn't receive any kind of communication? I know the answer. There's no specific reason or rhyme for that. Just that was the nature of how this information was delivered, and who the Lord had in mind at a particular moment that needed some kind of knowledge shared with them. The 7 churches of Asia, these 7 churches of Asia, that were going to receive this message. Yeah. And yeah. And I understand how that can be a challenge of understanding when is it symbolic and when it is not. And why I've concluded that it's not symbolic in relationship to this is because he specified which 7. To me, if he had said the 7 churches of Asia and stopped, then I might say to myself, well, there's more than 7, so he must have some kind of symbolic meaning in this. But he said 7, and then he listed the 7, which seems to me to point to this is what he means, these 7 churches. And especially when you look at chapter 2 and 3, they're very specific thoughts as it relates to them directly. I mean, specific challenges that each one of those 7 may or may not be experiencing. And so, sure, 7 within the book of Revelation will at times mean whole, complete, perfect. I just didn't see it because he specifies who he's sending it to. He says, I turned to see the voice. Oh, let me make sure I didn't skip any questions. Yeah, question 8, sorry. So the book was written to the congregation. Which of these 7? Thyatira, okay. But not to Troas, though it was in Asia, not to Miletus, not to Colossae. They were not listed. And for whatever reason, the Lord determined. Verse 12. So I turned to see the voice that spake with me. And being turned, I saw 7 golden candlesticks. Probably a better translation of the word there is lampstand. And the reason is, what do you think of when you think of candlestick? Right? You think of this little, and I say probably because there's some reason why some translations render it candlestick. But I believe from the original, stay on the screen for a minute. The specific definition that comes from Strong's is a lampstand, literal or figurative, candlestick, sometimes translated. So some translations you'll see it rendered as candlestick, Sometimes you'll see it as lampstand, just depends on your translation, dealing with the same figure, if you will, when you see that. So interestingly, I turned to see the voice. So in other words, when John first starts hearing, I am the Alpha and Omega, you can only imagine. I don't try to emphasize it because I'm sure my voice would be wrong. But you can only imagine. You hear, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. Write these things down. But he's hearing it from where? Apparently from behind him. Okay? The voice is from behind him. What do you generally do when you hear a voice from behind you? You turn around, figure out who is that? Who's talking to me? So I turned to see the voice that spoke with me. And translation, I may have to read a couple others, but I found it interesting in the King James. He's and being turned, almost as though he was being aided as he turns to hear this voice. I saw 7 golden candlesticks. Question I asked that question. John saw how many golden lampstands or candlesticks? 7. So 7 churches of Asia, 7 golden candlesticks. Turns to see who's speaking to him. Think about this imagery of this lampstand. If that's true, this lampstand would be filled with oil that would burn and give light for longer periods of time than a candle might. And in the midst of the 7 candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man, clothed with the garment unto the foot, and the paps with a golden girdle. And so he begins to describe whom? Jesus. And Jesus in his glorified form, clothed with a garment down to the foot, this golden girdle. Verse 14, his head and his hairs were white like wool. It doesn't say they were wool. It says like wool, as white as snow. And his eyes were as a flame of fire. And so when you see that description of those garments in verse 13, what do you think of? Royalty, right? You think of a king. When I turn to see him, I see the glorified king. Think about this. The last time John saw Jesus was when he did what? Ascent after his resurrection and walked among them. Not yet in some senses, in his kingly form. He is yet to ascend back to the right hand of the Father to be placed back in that position of prominence and authority. The last time John witnessed Jesus was that moment where he ascends back into heaven. Now in the Spirit, he sees the King of Kings. And he sees him, his garments in all things pointing, his hair like wool, as white as snow. What do you think of white? You think of purity. You know, this imagery of who Jesus is this great King. Yeah. Yeah, I think that because of the nature of the imagery, because he's showing us a picture of what we would see someone in royal form be shown as, and so he sees Jesus as you would see an earthly king, Son of Man. The imagery is that he sees him in that form. Why that form? Again, we'd have to use some speculation in relationship to that. But remember, if the core is right in that he's trying to encourage these Christians to get past the persecution. I saw your king. Okay, that's what John's saying. I saw your king, and he was adorned splendidly. You know, I think that's sometimes we get lost in the picture and forget why. Why? Because he's trying to realize that their faith in Jesus is not being wasted. And your your temporary persecution will eventually bring benefit because he's the king. I saw the king. With this pure, go ahead.
Very, very similar to Daniel chapter 7,
Mm-hmm.
13 and 14.
Yeah, which we had read back on Wednesday, but I think we can, maybe I can pull it back up quickly. Maybe not. I guess I can just do it this way too. Yeah. Yeah. And there's all kinds of things that might come in that picture. He says there in verse 13 of Daniel 7, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and kingdom, that all people, nations, serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. And we talked about how Daniel's revelations were shut up. They were contained because they were intended for a future time. And now here's John describing the very imagery that Daniel expressed as being literal and real for those people. Yeah. Yeah, that imagery comes back all the time, seemingly everywhere. Yeah, and come in the same way. So, right. And so that imagery is not something unfamiliar. We see it all the time. Verse 15. I'm sorry. Let me stop. I forgot to talk about one other aspect. At the end of verse 14, he says, and his eyes were as a what? Like a flame of fire. You ever saw somebody whose eyes and it could look like they could just look right through you? Piercing, penetrating. His eyes are like fire. He sees everything. He sees through everything. He sees everything. Demonstrates the kind of power that he has. Yeah, he's dressed in the eyes of fire, penetrating eyes. He has feet like fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace, and his voice is the sound of many waters. And you think about that picture. Go ahead, Brian.
I was going back to Daniel chapter 10, verse 6. His body also is like a beryl, and his face is the appearance of lightning, his eyes as lamps of fire, his arms and his feet as polished brass, and the voice of his words is the voice of.
Yeah, the Daniel's description of what is coming is exactly spot on to what happens in relationship to Jesus in those pictures. All right, we'll pick up then, Lord willing, on Wednesday. Go ahead and look at Revelation 2. I will get there Wednesday. I will get there Wednesday. That's a promise. Assuming I'm here Wednesday. If I'm not here, then do whatever you want to do.